welcome back to another episode of the Supply Chainy podcast. I am your host, Nathan Chaney, and today we're going to talk a little bit about entrepreneurship, but a lot about WMSs and just keeping your inventory straight, and then kind of just going through that process of picking the right WMS, picking the right way to structure your warehouse or your distribution center, make it as efficient and effective as possible. So, Casey, welcome to the episode, and thanks for sharing some time and expertise with us. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, I guess we could start with, I've been around the warehouse management space for, let's call it 20 years or so. I came out of school working for GE and then worked for some smaller firms doing the software in that space, in-house effectively. And then I moved my family to Raleigh 17 years ago to work for a company called Red Prairie that is now Blue Yonder through
never
acquisition.
Heard of those guys before.
Yeah, exactly, right? So yeah, been around for a long time that way. Funny enough, for the first several years of my career, had no idea I was in this thing called supply chain. No term for it. In my mind, I was a software engineer guy, right? That's what I did. I didn't necessarily know I was building this domain of knowledge that would help me later on in my career. Getting into Red Prairie kind of opened up a lot of doors because I knew things that you typically wouldn't if you're building software alone, right? Getting into like the carrier, like Quirks, UPS is something I'd worked with in the past that helped me build a niche at Red Prairie, where I was the parcel guy for a number of years, helping customers get out from underneath some of the scary stuff that can happen when you go live, in terms of not getting packages out there, shipping air, all that fun stuff. But I moved on from there after a few years. I worked for a 3PL for, let's call it about a year and a half. And I wanted to see the space just outside the software vendor. What's it look like to consult? I had a notion, but I wanted to, put some real reps into it. And it turned out I really loved it in terms of just the idea that my ideas and my thoughts were valuable. And I didn't necessarily have to stand behind what the vendor was doing wherever we were working, right? I could actually call out some things. Maybe a design choices weren't great for the customer. Maybe the flaws, I could have candid conversations and not be the whipping boy in a way, right? I did that for a year and a half. And then getting back to the concept of Red Prairie, they merged with JDA. And for some weird reason, the marketing message became, we don't do customizations. Anybody that knows the warehouse management space knows that there's a ton of surface area. And when you get in there, you're going to do something that's potentially off the beaten path, right? And that's where these really big customers spend a lot of money, 7 figures plus, to get in there and really adapt the software to their operation. Well, that was the message was, we don't do this. So it was a perfect catalyst for myself and 2 people I'd worked with before to hang our shingle and become, hired guns, mercenaries for a few months until the market kind of figured itself out. But lo and behold, 5 years later, we had grown to about 60 people. We were doing somewhere around 12 million in revenue per year. And, this thing had some lasting power to it. But about 5 years in or so, it's the typical, what do we do next kind of predicament. Sure. And I was very much bullish on the notion of managed services, adding that operational support layer to customers that have really big investments in the software. There's a difference between what a vendor can provide, right? They more or less, their support is, did you identify a defect? Can you show us the steps to reproduce it? Or do you have something that went off the rails that we can tweak some data to get you operational again? That's the extent, really, if you want to bake it down to something. But then there's the other piece where most customers think that they can call in, you'll know how they use the system, and then walk them through their processes. That didn't exist. So that's what I was bullish on, and I had really good success for it quickly. Very high margin work, satisfying that way. But my partners really wanted to build software. So there was this dividing point, and I was the odd one out, so I left, right? It's three's a crowd, I guess you want to call it. So I had a 2-year non-compete, COVID hit, not a whole lot going on there, right? Just surviving like everyone else in the US and around the world. But coming out of that, I had made friends with a former competitor of OpenSky, and he recruited me to come in and help him build out advisory. And that really was getting past the formula of the business at that point in time was they're focused on one vendor. They want to get beyond that and start earlier in terms of building business cases and helping customers figure out what's the best path forward. So did that for a year and a half, learned a ton. And at some point he decided he was going to retire, and I moved on at that point in time too. But all that led me to what I do now with Full Stride. It was all these lessons, these epiphanies that I'd had in terms of what do I want to do differently. Yeah, so the notion I came away with was the best customer, or best clients, I guess you want to call it, let's call it client, were the ones that were on the small side for these really big mega vendors, if you want to call them that, like Blue Yonder. And they loved the advice and the suggestions you would give, but they choked on the software most of the time because they could pay to enter, but the maintenance and everything else that went along with it, and the staffing requirements that aren't necessarily clear up front, usually ate them alive, right? But I loved working with them because they valued my expertise. But in the general sense, with most consulting firms, my first one being, no exception, is they feed you at first, but then most of the work is project based. So you go bigger and bigger, right? And then you look at these ones that got you going as the small ones. So they don't get the mind share they used to. But I wanted to build something that would actually stick with them in terms of, instead of outgrowing them, they outgrow you and you celebrate it when that happens, because great, we worked well together, that now you need something more than what I can give. So that was one of the aspects of what I wanted to build Full Stride around. And the other piece is, my original notion was, there's all these vendors that are a tier lower or just not in the top 4, right? They're still up and coming, striving. I wanted to work with them, build partnerships there. But unfortunately, maybe my mileage wasn't exactly great there. But what I was finding is some of these vendors just didn't have the ability to execute very well. They didn't have process behind the scenes. They were trying to emulate the mega vendors, so it's everything to everybody. Yeah. And I saw customers get chewed up in the process. So that was a realization at the end of last year, where I had yet another client implode, right? They bought something they weren't ready for. And when reality hit, it's either they just pull the plug, one had a reorg, and the whole team I was working with disappeared overnight. No warning, nothing. They were completely caught off guard as well. And I'm like, I can't continue doing this. I need to become independent. And that's really when I sat down and started looking and going, okay, well, what's the commonality between these clients I've worked with for the last year and a half? And then just looking back at my experience overall, and what it really came down to was, most businesses aren't ready to buy when they buy. There's all these assumptions and these unknowns that go unchecked, and they really hurt after the fact, because budgets are set, timelines are set, and then they realize that the clarity wasn't there that they thought it was. You ask them a straightforward question, and there's a bunch of people in the room, and they all give different answers. And that's a telltale sign that you aren't ready. There's work to be done here. And at that point in time, it's painful. It's a painful realization, because that means things have to change. You have to slow down some areas, and all kinds of things go sideways from there. So that's when the struggle bus shows up, right? So with all that, effectively, that's where I came up with the notion of clarity first. And it's readiness. It's a readiness assessment. It gets in there, and it answers three fundamental questions. Do you need a WMS? Are you ready for one? And then what should you be looking for in them? And then you can unpack all three of those questions, another layer there, but it's really designed to clarify what your business goals are, mature your business so you're ready for the software, and then filter out most of the vendors so you know what you're looking for, so you can get past feature parity and get into like those hairy use cases, so you know how well they do. And it doesn't mean they have to be 100%. At least you now know that if they aren't 100%, they're maybe 80%. And you have an understanding, at least at a fuzzy level, that there's going to be some type of cost to get them to that 100% or 95%, whatever it needs to be at the end of the day. But you're more informed.
You kind of mentioned that you can help people identify whether they need a WMS or not in the first place, right? And so that would mean you're talking to someone who's like on Excel spreadsheets and whatnot today, and just looking to grab some discipline and some consistency and put some actual proper processes in place. And I know companies, I have clients that are multi-million-dollar, 40-year-old organizations that don't have a WMS at all, right? Nope. And so can you kind of talk a little bit from that perspective? Just, if there's somebody in one of those organizations sort of listening, can you give a couple nuggets of wisdom or things for them to think about?
Yeah. So typically when I ask the question, we start thinking about, do you need a WMS? I'll tell somebody, or someone will say, well, you're never going to say no. You have this vested interest in it. I'm like, well, I don't know if that's true, but I'm very likely to tell you not yet. It's eventually every business that grows, there's going to be a certain point where if you're shipping product, you're going to need a warehouse management system. It's a foundational piece. But typically when I say not yet, it really comes down to there's an aspect here, and I use this as a proxy for what kind of companies would work well with me in terms of complexity. And they've already bought a ERP, they deployed it, but are they fully leveraging it? what does that look like behind the scenes? Because there's a lot of maturity that goes on in order to get to the point where a warehouse management system makes sense for you and you can get the mileage out of it that you think you're going to get. That's one aspect there in terms of like the ERP piece of it. Are you using it to its full capabilities? There are modules that will do some semblance of warehouse management that'll get you very far. But I mean, if you have it and you're not using it, let's look at that to give you some kind of mileage. But
Sure.
the other aspect of it too, really, it kind of comes in there is that there's two sub questions to the do you need it? What are your business goals? What are you trying to achieve? If you're growing in a way where you're not necessarily growing your operation, then maybe it's a not yet still. But if you are, then we need to tackle those objectives and figure out how to build them into a business case for pursuing software. And one of the ways I like to do that is this concept of cost of inaction. So instead of ROI, where it's all these fuzzy hypothetical stuff out there, like we can do all these great things afterwards, it's more of, if we don't move, what is the real cost to our business? What are the limitations that are we okay with that? Is that a small enough number or limitation where we can still stick with the not yet answer? Or is there something very big there that if we don't move, it's gonna hobble us in the future? So focus more on those pain points that way in terms of articulating it, putting numbers to it, getting past the emotion.
Yeah, so I've got, again, I know of a company that's got an ERP, implemented one, did not spring for the WMS module, right? So it's like a lot of the organization kind of moves forward, gets a lot of good best practices going, and the production line, warehouse area, manufacturing area is running on Spreadsheets. So for that type of customer, that logistics manager side of the house feels a little bit left out, and they're like, no, I really need this to make my organization better as well. Is there any ammunition or that you could provide them to be able to go back to their leadership?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to the spreadsheets feel great, and they are great for a very small window of time. After that, spreadsheets are notoriously brittle, right? You can't necessarily spread the burden of who's maintaining and updating because there's so many ways you can step on each other's toes.
Sure.
But another aspect of it is the bigger your warehouse gets, the more likely is people are acting on data that's not necessarily accurate. Right, things change, and then there's this concept of I need to come back. I either need to radio into somebody or I need to come back centrally to get my next piece of work or level set on what I was trying to do. And if you don't do that, you risk the mistakes in being introduced to doing something that now doesn't make any sense. And okay, now you got to undo it, bring things back. Or I thought I had an idea of what I was getting, but I got there and I grabbed something from the wrong location. I mean, there's all these things that don't happen when you have spreadsheets. The real-time scanning, visibility, orchestrating the work out on the floor. And those things really bubble up the bigger you get. So that's one thing right there I talk about a lot in terms of getting past the spreadsheets. And actually, I'll take a detour for just a second.
Sure.
I've worked years ago, my first company, we went into a company that was doing $8 billion worth of revenue, moving around, huge. And I went into one of their warehouses, 1 million square feet, and they're paper-based. And it blew my mind. I'm like, how do you not implode? So, I mean, this isn't just a small business issue. I mean, there's plenty out there that have somehow just stumbled forward and done very well in some places, but underinvested in others. And it was a huge upside to them once we got that out of the way and they could actually make decisions in real time. They cut through so much noise. They could actually fulfill more orders all in the same space. So it was one of those things where you don't have to get bigger, but you can get way more productive in the same area that way. So that's one thing. But a lot of what I deal with when you're dealing with spreadsheets, one of the most notorious issues in your warehouse is travel. And that's what you get a warehouse management system. You can cut down on a lot of it. You can avoid some of the weird stuff there, but it's a massive jump going from paper-based or spreadsheets to your first warehouse management system. And right there, that's a huge part of the operation is the labor cost, right? If you can cut out a lot of that, make it more efficient, then you can get more done in the same amount of time, but you can also cut out a lot of overtime because of those inefficiencies. So a number of things I could probably keep going on in tangents there, but those are big ones anyways.
So that was a lot of discussion from that very early, company that's going from spreadsheets up into making it WMS. But maybe I'll ask a question on that. What percentage of people do you come across and like how surprising is it to you? I mean, you just talked about an $8 billion-dollar company, I guess, that was still using paper. But is it still like really surprising to you how many people don't have a WMS? Like, does it still kind of blow your mind a little bit, or is,
It
where do we
does.
sit at that?
It does. But I have to say, so with Full Stride in the last 2.5 years or so, I've worked with smaller businesses, mid-sized, the ones that are growing beyond just an ERP into something more capable, like a standalone warehouse management systems. I mean, it's a little more par for the course in that way, right? They might be using some type of module that has maybe some kind of mobile device they can scan with, but a lot of times it's still paper-based. It's the old guard that we've been doing it a certain way for a very long time. Why change to an extent? So there's that back and forth in terms of that. But one of the other issues I don't think I necessarily called out was it's the ramp up time. You bring somebody else in, people move and leave, right? It's just the nature of warehouse management. It's not a comfortable environment a lot of times throughout the year. It's a lot of manual work, and it's not necessarily for the faint of heart. So you have turnover. But when you bring somebody in and you don't have systems in place, it takes them a long time to unpack and discover effectively that tribal knowledge.
Sure.
Where someone who's been there for 10 years just knows it like the back of their hand, no problem.
Yep.
But the day they're out, your productivity goes way down, or
Sure.
they're pressured not to take vacation because what do you do when they're not here? So there's other elements there too that really make the case for let's operationalize and systematize the warehouse operation out here. Let's bake that into software that does it. And the people that maybe there's someone's been there for a month and there's someone's been there 10 years, they can make the same decisions because the system they're relying and leveraging the system with those rules that you've now codified. And that's a huge one right there too, right? You can bring people up so much faster, especially for peak season and those weird fluctuations throughout the year.
I was just talking the podcast that just came out recently with Mizba. One of her things is like, hey, you want to bring automation and robotics into your space, but you don't have a proper inventory management WMS. And so how are you supposed to provide the instructions for these robots on where they need to go? Or if you've got a drone inventory reconciliation, cool little drones flying around your warehouse, what data are they looking for and where are they feeding it back in to check and audit that stuff is where it's supposed to be? And so it's like some people almost want to like jump ahead to the cool new stuff, but they don't have the foundation. They've got to have the foundational level stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that feeds right into my second question. Are you ready for a WMS? You may establish a need, and even regardless, if you're not necessarily, if it's, the answer is still not yet, it's never too early to get ready. But that's where we get into all those foundational pieces there. I'm like, great, you see the capabilities and the promise of this new technology, but unless you're ready for it, you're not going to get the mileage out of it, right? And the way I break that down in terms of readiness and the homework that needs to be done, that's not necessarily flashy and sexy, is getting your people all on the same page. And it's implied, typically, most businesses think they are until you start asking questions and then you get multiple answers. That's the telltale sign that, okay, there's work to be done here, that you guys work well together, but there are lots of corner cases. There's room for dysfunction here. We need to actually get this documented and visualized. And I'm a big proponent of visual process diagrams because they're so approachable, right? You don't necessarily, reading a document is not the same as looking at a picture and seeing how these different pieces get connected and some of the call outs. So I do a lot of that work in terms of being an advocate for it. But once you've get those people thinking about how they need to work and interact, you can build those things out and get your process clarity. But it also adds another dimension there where you can say, okay, well, there's an interaction point here between two different teams. There's the four wall, people that are inside the warehouse operation, and there's all these adjacent teams, sales, customer service, purchasing. There's a myriad number of them. But when you see that how there's potential for interaction, there's also potential for friction or dysfunction. And I use an example. A lot of times it's like sales talks to a customer or customer service does, depending on how the relationships worked out. And they want this small change late in the game. And then they agree to it, and it comes to the operation who has no real recourse at that point in time. And there's potentially a big cost to them in terms of productivity or rework or undoing work. And it becomes this finger pointing frustration level there. So when we get to that process mapping component, we can talk like, okay, well, what are the guardrails that need to be here? What's reasonable in terms of like cutoff times, pushback, expectations? And let's bake that into this so everyone's on the same page. For instance, just as a super generic example, we can't make changes after 3 p.m. on a given day. Okay, well, if that's true for this business, you arm the sales or customer service people with that knowledge. And when they're talking to the customer, they can have a candid conversation and say, okay, well, if this change you're asking for is before 3, we can probably accommodate it. We'll talk. But if it's after, it's going to be a next day kind of thing, right? Is that okay with you? Basically, it's like you put the choice in the customer's hands, and they make an informed decision that way, and then you roll with it versus all these weird, ugly things that can happen. And as an example, if it's not there and someone has to pull something off a trailer, it's not just that customer's order that's infected. It's who else was on that trailer. Now the delays creep in. Someone else is going to be paying for that. There's this concept of subsidized behavior there that's not necessarily called out or really visualized. So getting the guardrails in place is a huge one for business maturity in general. But the other piece you were talking about in terms of the data, that's a huge one, right? You have all these shiny features, you have this technology that's sexy, and you put in automation, but guess what? The things that are in people's heads today need to be put into a system somewhere. That source of truth we talked about, or you think you did, but that's an important one, is figuring out where it lives, and is it consistent and accurate, and is it something that this new software can make decisions based on? If it's not there, you're not going to get the mileage out of the system that you thought you would. In general, I was reading something this morning. In fact, they were talking about some type of optimizing the workflow and the tasks on the ground, and how their AI solution can help with all that. But what they don't talk about, and what's really there under the covers, is there data there that the system can act on to make some type of informed decision. And if it's not, and a lot of times it's not, then you're not going to get that behavior. It sounds awesome, but then it's a letdown after you buy and you realize that, we're not even close. So that's one of the big things I do too, is, okay, well, if you want this functionality or you're behaving a certain way on the floor, okay, well, does anybody besides Jack know how to determine where you put this inventory, or how you carve up work on any given day? And if the answer is no, then like, okay, well, we need to figure out what are the decision criteria that he's using today that we can put in the software and figure out where that lives. So tomorrow the system's doing it for you, doing it consistently every single time. And, Jack can take a day off, or Jack can work on and maybe get promoted to some other function in the warehouse, and he's not hamstrung to this forever. So there's a lot of that needs to be unpacked, and it unfortunately doesn't get done until you've bought and you get in there and you realize that you can't make those decisions, or you're going to spend a lot of time on a certain part of the implementation that you weren't planning on. And this goes back to my post this morning, where it's like a ripple effect. You spend more time up front doing design to get all these things answered that you thought were there, and then something else has to give unless you can figure out, can I get more time or more budget? And a lot of times that means testing and training get railroaded, and then your risk goes way up, right? That's the scary part of the reality of not doing this stuff up front.
I'm going to try to see if we can take this conversation a little bit away from the nuts and bolts operations side of things and start to go level up a little bit. One, you've talked a lot about SOPs and processes and documentation. Do you have a favorite best practice for documenting all these flowcharts and having SOPs and having this sort of company-wide SOPs sort of thing? Is there some tools or a tool out there you recommend people look at?
Gotcha. Well, diagramming tools. I use Lucid. It's just something I'm familiar with. I like the concept of it. I don't do anything crazy complicated. Most of the work really is going to be talking to people and getting them to agree. And then now we document in a simplistic way where everyone's on board and they can see it and they can really digest it quickly. But in terms of the way I go about it, typical process diagrams, I like swim lanes. Those are very helpful to see where the different teams and different technologies are involved and where those handoffs are and the interactions. Mm-hmm. Those are a very quick way for someone to digest what's going on and commenting and noting what's going on there in terms of like behind the scene decisions or just some of the criteria, the concepts that are involved, make that digestible pretty fast. So nothing fancy. I'm a pretty straightforward guy, and part of my mantra with Full Stride is I try not to sound like a consultant. I don't use big words, or just trying to be super clever. I'm like, okay, well, if it can be done simply, I'm going to go that way. And I'm going to break these things down so they're approachable to everybody. So my audience is larger that way. And then, we don't have to reinvent the wheel most of the time. The biggest part of what I do is really, it's just a framework and a process in terms of being opinionated and going about it in a certain way that I've seen success. I don't know if you saw the interview I did with Ben Hopkins for the Warehouse Underground. We talked about the concept of how I go about doing the deep dives when I go on site, part of my Clarity First framework. And I go backwards. I start with shipping, and I'm looking for what are the things that need to happen to meet a customer promise. And I start layering them on and figuring out where do we need to make that decision or where we get that data from. And it's completely different than what maybe the status quo is today. We're not going surface level. We're going what's needed for being minimally viable. And then when we're done there, all the way down to the receiving, we'll turn around and go back through the process to figure out where it can be more efficient, because it's effective, but man, it is dog slow. So what can we do there? And that's when some of the cool technology or different approaches kind of come in too. And you can see some of the fancy upsides to that. And that's where maybe automation down the road could be helpful, robotics, but typically it's more of my sense. It's you're going to bring a warehouse management system in, and here's how it can help right here. It can cut out a lot of that manual labor and some of the error-prone behaviors that just naturally happen when you're like an opt-in process only kind of operation.
Got it. Let's talk a little bit about folks that have already implemented a WMS and they're looking and they've outgrown it, to what you were saying earlier. Maybe they're going from the small size sort of user to medium size, and they're finding that their WMS doesn't really meet the needs that they need anymore. Any insights you can share with that group?
Yeah. So I was actually having a conversation in the comments this morning in my post with the gentleman talking about that to an extent, because he was like, well, I typically see, instead of spending too much time in design, it's more of configuration and bug fixing effectively. And I counter back to him saying, well, that's more of an upgrade path versus your first system. So one thing I would advocate for there is, just because you have a system in place doesn't mean you shouldn't go back and really clarify processes. There's a lot of stuff that's baked into the system, but it's not necessarily documented. And that's the cold hard fact of it is, most of the time, because I started out working with massive clients, upgrading effectively, where they were way further on the maturity curve, but they still had the same issues. You ask for documentation and you might get a few different charts or some documents. Most of them are half baked. They're very old. And if you start talking to people, they're like, yeah, we don't work that way. So and that should be eye-opening. Okay, there's a lot of ambiguity in our operation here. Clearly, even though we have systems in place, there's still a lot of tribal knowledge. Chances are the reason you're upgrading is because you're working around the system you have. And when you have all those edge cases piling up, now it's time to clarify it again, if you haven't already before. Let's level set. Let's really understand the current state and where your gaps are. And then let's document that and figure out how we're going to plow forward. And then that helps inform the selection process for the next system, because not all WMSs are created equal. There's a huge range. I think the stat I've seen, and I know it's an old stat, 200 plus vendors, and a lot of them in there potentially are probably bit rotting, right? They haven't really been updated, or they were very niche in the beginning. But at the same time, there's plenty out there that are really good that you might not know about because they don't play the Gartner Magic Quadrant game, or they just didn't make it, right? They weren't big enough to pay the play, or they're too niche in certain offerings, so they don't make the general purpose kind of quadrant out there. So that's my unpolished answer to that one. Because, like I said, with Full Stride, I really don't work with upgrading. It's much more oriented around moving from ERP only to the first warehouse management system and all the maturity that goes along with getting there successfully.
Gotcha. It sounds so similar to a conversation that I've had with other folks that are talking about, they're in the commercial real estate space or in the automation or in the warehouse optimization space. And it's almost the same thing that you just said, which is, hey, if you're thinking about upgrading and going bigger, investing more money, how about you pause and let's take a look and make sure that you're getting every bit of mileage out of what you've got in place today first. Have someone come in and help you have that conversation, help dig in, ask the questions, and get the most utilization out of what you've got today, making sure that you're using it as much as you can before you go make the big investment or make that big change.
I actually have a story there.
Okay.
I can kind of add some weight to that. The whole
go for it.
That thought process. I worked with a distributor last year. They had worked with a big advisory firm, done this this assessment, whatever you want to call it, 100-page document, and they use that as their gospel for evaluating vendors. And they selected one. And after they had selected one, that's when my company and myself, whatever, I came in to help. And all these decisions had already been made. When we went back and we were going through requirements, they were frustrated with the vendor because they didn't support the use cases like they thought they did. And they're like, but it's in our document. And I went back, just as an example, lot management. Literally, there was a paragraph on it. No teeth, no real requirements, just this general concept that they believed that there was enough because they were trusting the advisory firm that the vendor would understand what they meant. And when we got in there and really started asking questions, it was clear it did not even come close to meeting their requirements. Lo and behold, that means costly enhancements, right? So they were upset, reasonably so. Fast forward, there was a number of these things that happened, and they were pretty jaded about it. They didn't necessarily appreciate how complicated it would be to integrate their ERP with WMS, because old system, on-premizations, which means any kind of prepackaged integration, which didn't exist between these two vendors, would have been customized anyways, because you colored outside the lines, right? That's the reality of it. So it took them a year to try to find a partner that would help them with it, and they struggled. So they pushed back, and lo and behold, they paused, right? And it's like, well, I don't know if we're going to do this. We got to rethink. They disappeared. They came back, and they did two things. First was, can we get out of the contract? So, and of course they couldn't. The WMS contract was ironclad. They were bought in for 3 years, regardless of they used it, which is the scary thing that I talk about a lot. It's just unfortunate. But the other aspect of it, they were like, well, I don't know. Like, maybe we're just not using our ERP enough. And then that's when they're coming back to figuring out, can we get more mileage out of it? And I'm like, where was that conversation originally? Yeah. This advisory firm you worked with, that should have been it seems like a pretty obvious question to me. Why wasn't it answered? Why wasn't it asked? I'm like, maybe you could have got more mileage out of what you're doing, but you went and you pulled the trigger. You spent a bunch of money with them, and you spent a bunch of money with a vendor that may have been premature in a number of ways. I'm never going to say working with an advisory firm isn't a good idea. What I would say, though, is if you're working with a really big one and you're a mid-sized business, your mileage is not going to get very far, right? Their expectations and their expertise are at a different level. They're looking for they're always thinking about the really big technologies or those small incremental improvements, because they assume you're already mature. If you're not, you're not going to get what you think you're going to get out of them. In fact, that's really what it was. And it was heart-wrenching talking to them. I'm like, you spent a bunch of money for this. It's 100 pages, but it's all basic observation. There's no analysis in there. There's no real recommendations. There's a couple prescriptive ideas out there, but I'm pretty sure it was written by somebody very junior that didn't really understand your space. And I'm sorry, but you more or less were hoodwinked.
Yeah.
That's happened more and more. But that was just like one of those examples out there that really resonates with me, and I use it all the time when I'm talking to folks. I'm like, this is the kind of stuff that happens when you don't get the right advice early on, or you don't challenge, the stuff where you don't know what you don't know. And if you don't surface that, you pay dearly after the fact.
Let's take a minute, kind of here in the closing minutes here. One of the questions that I like to ask is from the perspective of a student. Sure. I really like to engage and interact with a lot of college students and go and talk to classes. I got one later today. And so I usually try to ask the question from their perspective of, if they were listening to this podcast today and hearing like what you do, what suggestions would you make to them?
Well, I guess there's probably a couple paths. Maybe mine isn't necessarily straightforward or typical. Like I said, I started out very technical and then kind of fell into this domain, supply chain warehouse management. They give me a different kind of perspective, but it's not typical. More or less when I'm working, talking to people and meeting them, they came from the operations side. So I would say in general, really is you're looking to see the big picture where you're working, wherever you start, you get in there. It's going beyond the service level and asking questions to understand why things the way they are the way they are versus just taking it as the way it is. So in terms of, I've had so many people when I had my first business, they were coming out of operations and they wanted to get into consulting. So maybe that's the angle I'll take, is how do you get here? And I'm like, okay, well, in terms of that, what you could do is you need to have some type of project-based experience. So you're on the operations side. If you can get into one of these projects, I know they're kind of scary because they're so big, so visible, and they're risky in a lot of ways, right? But being the person that signs up for it and willing to learn and ask questions and dive deep into why we do certain things and then peel it back. There's plenty of frameworks out there you could use. The 5 whys, there's a bunch of other ones out there too in terms of where you're working. But get good at asking those questions because they're going to be very valuable for you as a consultant down the road in terms of getting people on board and really kind of getting past that surface level, like I had said before. But another thing really is there's a technical aspect to the systems here. When I came up through, it was very much, there was a lot of behind the scenes that I don't think is necessarily there like it used to be. There's an advanced mode, if you want to call it that. But when you get a lot of these newer systems, they're cloud-based and they're cloud native by default, the ones that are up and coming. So that's where I would say really focus there. I mean, you're going to have the big stalwarts like the mega vendors, the Blue Yonders and whatnot, and they all want to get there. But it's a massive shift from the old days of where they were explicitly installed, and then they have versions, and there's all this power behind the scenes, which adds a lot of complexity. They really want to get to the cloud native piece of it. So that's where the industry is going. So I mean, there's a argument to be made that if you focus on some of them, you have work for a long time because the tail of maturity and getting off them is really long. But a lot of times it's pretty painful too. And the reason I would say not to go that route necessarily, unless it really, really lights your fire, is you're going to do a lot of tactical work. You're going to be stuck in that realm. Whereas if you're working with some of the newer systems where it's much more visually oriented, you have awesome configurable workflows that allow you to tailor. Those are much easier to approach and get started on. And you can more or less stay more focused on the business aspect of what you're trying to achieve versus getting stuck in the technical details of one particular vendor or not. But then you have the next layer, a lot of these APIs that are out there. If you can understand how to work with those, you can do a lot of cool things that aren't necessarily available out of the box. And that's traditionally where the customization lived, but they were always on the vendor side. Now there's this ability to build something that lives on your side of the fence that you don't necessarily have to pay the vendor to keep updating, which is the other scary dark side of the old guard, the old incumbents, where you would customize something, then you pay for it every time you upgrade or every time you renew. There's this ongoing cost. Yeah. If you can own more of that based on just the way that they architect software today, you get much more mileage out of it, and I think that's probably the way to go. So
yeah. So hey, thanks for coming on the podcast today and sharing some of your knowledge. It was a great perspective to have. I've had folks from the WMS providers. I've had David from Lodua come on, but I haven't had really anyone from that sort of consultative sort of perspective talk about it. So I appreciate you coming on today, and any closing remarks from your side?
Again, I didn't necessarily have anything prepared, but the one thing I like to harp on really is don't wait. A lot of the folks that go looking for the software wait until some type of external urgent event is coming up, and then all kinds of trade-offs come from there. So the earlier you can start preparing and start thinking about it, just to understand your options, the better you're going to be downstream. So that's one of the reasons why I structure my Clarity First solution that way, is I make it so it's affordable. It's a small investment with massive ramifications down the road whenever you decide to pull the trigger and go with the WMS down the in your future. So it's one of those things that I would say is don't wait, right?
Yeah.
Get your answers early so you have the time needed to invest properly, roll with the punches, and then make really good decisions down the stream.
Thanks for coming on, Casey, and chatting with us today. And I'll see you around the supply chain hood.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate having me on. All right, take care.